Hace Inglés presenta Into the Story, el podcast para aprender inglés con historias reales contadas por gente de todo el mundo. It doesn't get much worse than breaking a bone. But what about breaking two bones at the same time, the week before starting a new job?
I've been very, very drunk, failed to recognize the floor approaching rapidly, and didn't absorb the landing in any way. So I just kind of landed with straight legs and smashed into the pavement.
As painful and shocking as it sounds, Simon's attitude is far from sad or disappointed. On today's episode, Simon shares his story of how a night of singing karaoke turned into 6 weeks in a wheelchair. We'll hear how he used this experience as the starting point for a new life as an entrepreneur in Barcelona. We're calling this story Wheeling Your Way to Success. Before we begin listening, let's talk about some of the vocabulary and expressions you'll hear Simon say. A landing. A landing is basically when something goes from being in the air to being on the earth. So a plane makes a landing. A bird can make a landing. Es un aterrizaje. Aterrizaje, which is an extremely difficult word for an English speaker to say, by the way. You'll hear Simon talking about absorbing a landing when he refers to not landing very well after jumping from a tall surface. To fade. To fade is when something slowly or gradually becomes less and less. You'll hear Simon talking about his level of adrenaline fading. To crawl around. To crawl around, or simply to crawl, is when you move around on your hands and feet. Crawling is what a baby does before walking. To bear weight. To bear weight is basically to poner o soportar peso. You'll hear in the story that Simon is told not to bear weight on either of his legs, not to poner peso en ninguna de sus piernas. And finally, to be shattered. To be shattered has a few different meanings, one of which is to be very drunk. However, in this story, it is used as an adjective for broken. For example, if you dropped a glass on the floor, it would shatter. Just a quick note on pronunciation and accents. We recorded this interview online with Simon, so you may notice that the sound quality isn't as clear as it could be. Try to listen closely to Simon's Yorkshire British accent, and you may hear him cutting off the last letters of a word, for example, Manchester instead of Manchester, or dropping the H at the beginning of a word, for example, instead of home. If you need some more help understanding Simon's story, remember each episode you can get a full vocabulary and listening comprehension activities on our website, acingles.com. That's la letra A, letra C, inglés.com. And one last note here, this story deals with themes related to alcohol. So if you're with younger listeners, you may want to skip this one. Okay, let's get into the story.
Many years ago in Manchester, to celebrate finishing my first attempt at having a job where I'd worked full-time for a year after finishing being a full-time student and hadn't really enjoyed very much. And I thought, well, good idea is I'll quit this job and start a new job that pays a lot more money. I'm going to be a team manager for Barclaycard, credit card company. So anyway, to celebrate escaping from the previous job, which had been being a team manager in Ticketmaster, I decided to go out for a drink, which is like the tradition in England. Well, you notice a big difference when you first move to Spain. Very sensible drinking culture that they have here of drinking a very small beer very slowly. Whereas in England, we have the very unhealthy habit, as you'll see, drinking a very large beer very quickly and then repeating this process multiple times until you are very drunk. We ended up in a karaoke bar, finished the night by singing I Did It My Way by Frank Sinatra, and then had this kind of Frank Sinatra style vibe going on in the drunkenness. And on leaving the bar, saw a shipping container and thought, a good idea would be to climb up on that shipping container and do kind of like a Frank Sinatra style dance on top of the shipping container, which I did, I'm sure, very well. But what failed me was the landing skills, because when I jumped off the shipping container, I've been very, very drunk, failed to recognize the floor approaching rapidly, and didn't like absorb the landing in any way. So I just kind of landed with straight legs and smashed into the pavement, which hurt, which should be a sign. If you feel pain after probably like 12 pints of strong ale, this is probably a sign, if this happens to anybody else in the future, that you should probably go immediately to the hospital. But I didn't, because we had a big like party planned and I was DJing at the party. So I was like, no, we must go on. So I managed to get to the bus with the aid of some friends, kind of arms over the shoulders of the friends, get on the bus. That's where we're going. When we got off the bus at the other side, it was like really hurting. Maybe the kind of adrenaline was fading, the alcohol was fading. It's like, oh, I don't think I can walk any further. So my equally drunk friends, also heading to the party with me, had the amazing idea of, we saw this big, like in the UK outside the pubs, they have these massive bins on wheels where they put all the bottles, empty bottles. So they took the giant bin, sat me on top of the bin, and then wheeled me about a kilometre back to the party where I was DJing, just kind of abandoning this ball bin out on a nice residential family street in the suburbs of Manchester. Unfortunately, I managed to DJ. I was being quite tall. I'm like 6'2", 188 centimeters. So I was able to DJ kneeling, just kind of reaching up to the decks. So the party was saved. The next thing really was waking up the next morning. The first thing I noticed was the pain in my head, and then I'm trying to get out of the bed and stand up, the like screaming pain in the ankles. And then I looked at my ankles and they were like watermelons. So I had to kind of crawl down the stairs and then say to my friend, my flatmate, who had a car, I think you need to drive me to the hospital. The nurse was like, oh, can you just walk up and down for me? So I was like trying to walk him down, like, oh, this really hurts. She was like, and she sent me for an x-ray. And then when she came back, she's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. They sort of sat me down, put me in a bed, said, yeah, it's critical that you don't bear any weight on either leg, because you've like shattered the right ankle and like cracked the left heel like all the way through. So it's probably going to be some surgery needed on the ankle, and you're going to need both in a cast, and yeah, you can't put any weight on either leg. So who's your GP, like your general practitioner? But I've been from Yorkshire. Yorkshiremen don't go to the doctor. So I'd never been to the doctor. I'd never registered with a GP. So I didn't have one. And they're like, oh, you don't have one? But you need a GP in order to get a wheelchair. Wheelchair is provided by your GP, not from the hospital. I was like, what do I do then? So I don't know. They disappeared for like literally like 2 hours. And then they came back. They had a pair of crutches. And I was like, a pair of crutches? And like, but you told me before it was absolutely imperative that I didn't bear weight on either leg. So yeah, if you've ever tried to use crutches without putting either foot on the floor, it's quite a a difficult process. And then on the Monday, the most kind of, what I thought was just going to be an embarrassing thing was the thought of having to call the new job and tell them, just to warn you, I'll hopefully, if I can find one, be coming in a wheelchair. But when I rang them, they said, slight problem there in that the building, it's an old building, is not wheelchair accessible. So that was the first realization of, oh dear, I am now unemployed. And then having to ring kind of like the social security place to say, look, I just finished my job. I had a new job lined up. I've broken both my legs. Is there anything I can do? Like, well, you'll have to come down to the office. It's like, oh. And then when I finally managed to make it down to the kind of social security office, after having finally found a wheelchair and dragged myself down there, they told me, oh no, you've not paid enough social security in the previous how many years, because I was a student basically. So you're not entitled to claim anything. Wheelchair bound for 6 weeks, and then on crutches for about, I think, another 6 weeks after that. I mean, on the bright side, I was doing a part-time master's at the time, which I had made zero progress on before having broken the legs. And I think the only reason I ever actually completed the master's was because I was just stuck in the house for 6 weeks. So, that was a bonus. And I watched many, many DVD box sets. Say the first day I got out of the wheelchair and had the cast taken off, it was a bit of a shock because literally just couldn't stand up by myself. Getting about was still like a considerable challenge. I mean, I'm the kind of person that has just kind of glasses always half full kind of perspective. So like I rehabilitated myself from the broken legs and then got like really into strength training, fitness training. I hated the first job I did, and I think, there was a lot of built-up tension there, released in this kind of cathartic experience. Maybe it was some kind of unconscious way of saying, don't do this again, don't work again. And I, unconsciously broke both my legs to try and sabotage going to do another kind of 9-to-5 office job that didn't quite work. So after that, I went on again and I worked one more year, exactly 1 year in the next company before just quitting and saying no more of this. And then ended up qualifying as like a personal trainer, and then quit the second job to start like a personal training business and working for myself. I read a book called The 4-Hour Work Week by a guy called Tim Ferriss, this American author, which was kind of like how to make a living, but that requires very little input in terms of time, so like 4 hours a week, rough guideline, and it can do from anywhere, kind of like digital nomad style lifestyle. So I read this book, started these kind of online businesses, which gave me the kind of freedom to travel and move around, which is more incentive to keep both legs functioning.
Okay, that's all for today. Si te ha gustado este podcast y quieres seguir escuchando, puedes visitar nuestra página web acengles.com, donde tendrás todos los episodios de Into the Story. También encontrarás algunas actividades y materiales de cada episodio para ayudarte a mejorar tu inglés. Thank you for listening. We hope you have a good time, or at least a good story to tell.